We're wrapping up President's Week in the British Columbia Football Conference, and last up on the docket is BCFC President Tyler Mclaren. Tyler, thanks for doing this.
No problem, anytime.
So let's, I guess, just kind of back up. You had the BCFC AGM a few days ago now. Let's just talk about the season past, season forward. Give us your take on the BCFC past and future.
It was good. The AGM was fine, and that was kind of the wrapping up of the previous season. So I thought it was good to reflect back on some of the things we did well and some of the things we didn't do well, and obviously start planning for 19. But there was lots of positives. The parity in our league was good, as everybody knows, last year with the standings and the uncertainty on who's going to host playoff games or even make the playoffs. So that was something that was positive to see. A lot of our teams said they were pleased with their attendance at parks. I know there was a large spike in Chilliwack, which was going to see a lot of community interest with the resurgence of what the Huskers did on the field. So there was a lot of positive stuff, a lot of joint ventures that the teams worked on together, a lot of cooperation, a lot of the stuff setting the building blocks to move forward in 19, 20, and so on beyond. So a lot of groundwork was laid in 18, and a lot of positive steps were made, and hopefully we can translate that into what we do in 19.
In talking to the 6 presidents when we did, while their situations are entirely different in each market, they're so similar in terms of, at the end of the day, budgets are a tough nut to crack. Recruiting players is a tough nut to crack. I guess what do you see as the biggest challenge for, maybe putting you on the spot here a bit, but what's the biggest challenge for BCFC team?
Well, I think we do have to get more collaboration, because costs are going up and budgets are going up, and our functioning of our entire league is with costs and everything else. So I think there's power in our numbers, and I think there's different initiatives that we could do, whether it be looking at travel scenarios, looking at different joint ventures that if we get the collaboration from and the support of the other teams, that they can realize that we have more power together than what they're doing all by themselves. And I think everybody's traveling, everybody's buying things, everybody's doing a lot of the same things like you mentioned, but they do have differences with how they're doing them. But the end game is still, teams are getting on buses, teams are buying helmets, teams are doing a lot of the same things. So I think the steps that we made in 18 and the bigger picture viewpoints that most of the teams, all the teams now are following and endorsing, I think will allow us to expand on those and hopefully get some cooperation moving forward with some new initiatives, and I think that's the key is our strength in numbers.
You talk about collaboration at the AGM. One of the areas that we spent a lot of time on was the scheduling. That'll be out shortly. But one of the biggest part of the conversation was coming up with game times that would make things a little bit easier for the visiting team in terms of either getting on and off the ferry, avoiding a hotel, that sort of thing. But it's funny, after the meeting, a couple of the presidents said, this is great that we're working to make things easier for the visiting team, but it sometimes can affect our crowds as well. And the debate afterwards was, I'd rather pay the hotel, potentially have a little tougher trip going so I can host when I want and put more bums in the seats. Mm-hmm. Where's that balance? And maybe can't.
I think it's definitely valid, and I think our thinking has been a lot of catering to the visiting teams when they're going to the other teams' respective parks, and maybe that is the wrong approach, and that's something that with the forward-thinking people that we have, that there might be some validity to it. And one of the other things that came out of the AGM was just brand awareness and consistency with schedules, and knowing that Team A plays at 7 o'clock on Saturday nights, and having that consistency is making their brand, having more people in the stands, having more awareness, having more people, corporate sponsors, and it's very valid, and it's kind of eye-opening, because I think in the past it was always looking at how we can save teams money and so forth on the way to a park, whereas instead of maybe the approach is to have a look and say, how can we maximize teams when they're coming to their park? And it works both ways. So it's just an almost a 180 flip to how you approach it. But a valid point where if we can put more people in the stands by having a game at a certain time, even if there's costs of that team when they leave their park, it definitely a valid point. And we may look at doing a couple team pilot project in 19 with that. And if there's success in it, teams can see the value and the revenue from the offset by the home attendance. Valid point. If your revenues are going up by 2 or 3 or 4 times, your expenses are only going up 1 to 2. It makes good business sense.
It's interesting though. At least the teams now are sitting down in a room and trying to come up with math that works. Wasn't that long ago teams were trying to schedule a home game just to stick it to the visitors as best they can to make it ugly.
Yeah, and that's something that we're really lucky that we have the group of people in that room that have that respect for each other, and the balanced schedule helps with that too. Is with knowing that there has to be cooperation on both sides because they're going to be leaving their park to go to Team A is going to be going to Team B and B is going to be going to Team A. So it's nice that people have that forward thinking and obviously trying to accommodate it. But a couple of people did point out and said maybe we're accommodating the visitors too much. Maybe we do have to look at accommodating the home side, and maybe there's validity to that.
Let's just talk about the makeup of the conference. We're currently sitting at 6 teams. We've had informal, at least, overtures from groups in Prince George and the Lower Mainland about possibly bringing a team in. Just your thoughts on that, what the teams are thinking and where the BCFC is going in the next few years?
Well, obviously, I think we have to look at every scenario, and our obligation, obviously, is to grow the sport, and there's no doubt that that's one of our mandates to do that. And obviously, it's great that there's appetites in different markets for junior football, and so those are positives. And obviously, we have to look at it and do our due diligence with it. Obviously, the problem is we have certain criteria that we have to be concerned about with stadium standards and those types of things, and making people aware of budgets and revenue streams and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, probably one of the biggest challenges is regarding players. And our PSO is doing a very good job to grow the game at the younger levels. But the reality is we're still at the point where a lot of our players are coming from out of this province, and it's hard to go outside our province and get those players, and then say to the other conferences that where we're getting those players from that we don't have enough players, so that's why we're coming into your provinces and recruiting. So players is probably, in my opinion, is probably one of the biggest challenges. And but obviously, if there's a solution to that, then we have to look at it. But obviously, it's something that we will look at and figure out if it makes sense. But obviously, we have to be concerned about where our players are coming from and where any new players are going to any new team.
It's a fine line, isn't it? Like you said, obviously growing the game is a good thing. That's what the CFL is trying to do going into Halifax and beyond, perhaps. But a team in the Lower Mainland would be wonderful, but does it negatively affect the other teams in the long run as well? And that's, I guess, the tricky part. And
that's the tricky part. And obviously, if we're trying to compete on a national level, we have to look out for. We have to have that mindset. And if some people will say if it's going to water down a product, I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's definitely an opinion that some people will share. But we have to be aware that that it's hard to say to a team outside of this province that we need your players. We need your players to fill our 6 teams. And by the way, we're going to now add a 7th team, an 8th team, a 9th team, or whatever. It's a tough thing because they're going to say, well, if you have all these teams, then why are you coming into our province to recruit our players? So players is probably one of the biggest challenges, and like I said, stadium requirements and all that kind of stuff is important too. But obviously, again, the goal is to grow the game and grow our league, but it has to be in the right under the right circumstances.
So while we're talking about players and recruiting, let's put a little bit of commercial in for the BCFC right now. We got our president. It is mid-March. and he is baking in the sun of British Columbia.
That is true. I'm fighting a bit of a cold, but I also am squinting. You can tell by my eyes right now. But the sun is shining. It is March. I have a light top on, and it is actually pretty hot today. So it's a nice day today. So being out in BC is had a little bit more snow this year, which is rare because usually we don't get any down here. But it's a beautiful day. It's a beautiful place to play, and like I always say too, is our facilities are consistently getting better. Our media coverage and support and that kind of stuff is outstanding. But our venues are such great facilities, and I think back when I was playing in the late '90s and where all of our parks are now to where they were back then is there's so many new parks and that weren't even around then, or parks that have been upgraded, and it's you can get a pretty good atmosphere in all 6 of our venues.
Our biggest partner with the British Columbia Football Conference, and Jamie Terrace was at our AGM last week. Our biggest supporter, our biggest benefactor is the BC Lions through their 50-50. Does this explain the 50-50, how it works, and just how critical the Lions are to the
Yeah, I mean, the BC Lions have been a long-standing supporter of all amateur football, and junior football is no different. And we have to make sure that we are adding value to them as a supporter. And obviously they want to grow amateur football, and they want to support all the levels, and that's something that's appreciated beyond words. But we're at the point now where and things change with people and philosophies, but we just have to make sure that they're aware of our appreciation, and also aware of our support and see our support. And I mean, our teams in our conference wouldn't be here without the BC Lions, and they're a great partner of ours. They're a great supporter of junior football and a great supporter of amateur football. So I think it's just critical that it's the reciprocation of support that goes both ways, and that's something in 18 we were pretty new and so forth. So 19 there's going to be a large priority of ours to make sure we're supporting the BC Lions, and that goes on a personal level and on a conference level, where if we can go to games, or if we can support, or we can do stuff on social media ourselves personally, or as obviously a conference and within our team. So I think it's important that you see a lot of support in different areas and obviously in the U.S. and all that, and sports is big, and I think it's a way of life, and it's a culture, and I think we have to do our part to reciprocate that and grow the Lions brand and support them wherever we can, and to get out and cheer for them. And CFL football, I'm a big advocate of it. I love it. I love watching it. It's great entertainment, and being at BC Place with the roof open and everything else, there's nothing better. So I think we just have to make sure that we're constantly doing our best to support the BC Lions and encouraging them on and off the field.
You're president of the BCFC, but you're also the BCFC rep with the Canadian Junior Football League. 3 conferences: BCFC, PFC, OFC. We talk a lot about how different the football climate is between the 3 regions. Let's just talk about your role with the CJFL, the communication between the conferences, where you see us going, where you see the CJFL going.
Well, the CJFL is we obviously have to. My role is obviously looking out for the conference and that scope, but obviously also think bigger picture what the national body's doing. So obviously one can affect the other, and if you have great ideas at the national level, they can translate into success at the conference level. So I think there's good communication. I think obviously each conference and each market has their own challenges, just like in our own regions here in BC. So I think it's just being aware and being respectful of those, and not trying to paint everybody with the same brush, because obviously we've got our challenges that the prairies may have or they don't have, and Ontario may have or don't have too. So I think it's again sharing best practices, sharing the strengths and weaknesses that we have, and not trying to say, well, we do this, why can't you, or we're good at this, why can't you be, and understanding how to get people to a level where we're consistently we're consistently good at that, at all of those things. So I think there's good communication. I think there's some excitement in with some different ideas that may or may not translate, again, forward thinking in 19 and 20. So hopefully that will translate, and we'll see the we'll see the impact right here in BC.
Speaking about the impact right here in BC, November this year, the BCFC hosts the Canadian Bowl. Our champion will have either the PFC or the OFC champion in our park. I believe the PFC goes to Ontario in the West Ontario, am I right?
Yep.
Let's just talk about that game. And I've talked to a couple of the presidents, we discussed it. When I talked to Rob Learvold in West Shore, we talked about the fact that they hosted the game in 2016 and lost a heartbreaker and really expected to be back, and stumbled a little bit the next 2 years. So Rob knows better than anybody how important that game is to his organization. Win or lose, just having that game, that national stage in his park, how important is it? How I guess you weigh in on how important it is to a specific team, but how important it is to the conference to showcase our facilities, the whole thing.
It's huge, and it's and I was at that game obviously in 16 and in West Shore, and the event was electric, and the Rebels did a great job of putting that on, and it's huge for our conference. It's huge to have those games, national games in our park. It's a recruiting opportunity. It's a national spotlight. We see media coverage go up in at that time of year, and coverage of the game and support and notoriety. It's just a different feel when it's a national game, even compared to a conference game. So I think it's a good idea. We're looking at the business models and the sustainability of those games, because obviously costs are expensive with travel and so forth. But the games themselves are hugely valuable, and we in BC have such parity with our teams that, like Rob said, he thought he might get back in 17 or 18 and didn't get there, and that team that they had in 16 was very, very, very good. And I think if you talk to the Rams, even they've noticed it getting to the Canadian Bowl last year, it's translated into more notoriety, potentially more players wanting to play in Langley because of that success, and I'm sure the Raiders experienced it in 17 as well. And so most of the teams, when they do have that Canadian Bowl taste, it translates into the successes in the following years. And if you get a team that goes on a run like the Saskatoon Hilltops, it obviously that just builds more of your own brand in your own area and your own market.
So we assume, and maybe we shouldn't, but past history says it's safe to assume it's the Hilltops that are coming. They win more often than not out in the prairies. You were in Saskatoon in November. What do you think home field advantage means points-wise? And that's, I know that's subjective, but the Rams went into Saskatoon. How many points do you think they were down before that game even started?
Well, a lot depends on the weather, so there's that component. But I think it's a travel situation. Now we're going more to that charter model where teams are in and out, so there's not that kind of lagging around wondering what you're doing and what you're gonna, and practice schedules. The teams want to go in later. It's easier on them. So I think it's a case of it's definitely harder to go into an environment like that and getting prepared for potentially bad weather and everything else. The one advantage that came up even obviously is whoever comes out of the prairies is going to have to make that trek to Ontario first, and then obviously make a trek to BC after that, assuming they win that game in Ontario. So you might be able to tire out some flyer legs on whoever comes out of the prairies if they end up coming to BC in November.
Any chance you're going to predict who our champion is hosting that game?
I wouldn't. Based on the last 4 years, I think I looked at it when in 8 years we've had we've had so many champions since basically, if you go back to say 13 was different from 14, which is different from 15, 16. So it's a crapshoot. I think there was a model, like 13 was the VI Raiders, 14 was Langley Rams, 15 was Sun, Rebels were 16, Raiders were 17, Rams were 18. So I think there's a trend there. So I think if the trend continued in that model, it would be the Suns' turn. But if anybody would put, I wouldn't put $5 on any of our teams, because it's such a crapshoot. And I know all of our teams are recruiting like crazy right now, and everybody's feeling good about it. And I talked to most of the coaches in our league and most of the people involved in it, and people are feeling great about their teams, and that's the best part of this year is the optimism. And I think it's pretty cool when you have that optimism. And I mean, you could probably make an argument for. Yeah, I wouldn't rule anybody out of this.
Well, I'm just laughing. Bob Reist in Chilliwack is watching this. He's probably thinking, right, okay, Mr. President, we'll throw another team into that mix.
Well, and the beauty is a team like Valley, who had a great success last year, if they win this year, like that would really throw the whole parity thing up in the air, because then I think you'd have 4 champions in 4 years, or 5 in 5 years, or something like that. So maybe if Bob and the Huskers can do that, can come through this year, I think that would be 5 in 5 years. So that would be kind of cool. So yeah, they've done a great job there, and they have just as good an opportunity as anybody else. So I think it's the parity's awesome, and we saw it last year like we've never seen before. And not knowing who's going to host playoff games or make the playoffs is something that I think adds value, and I think it's our teams all feel they can all compete with each other, and even our scores. I mean, Kamloops didn't have the wins as the other teams did, obviously, but even their scores. I mean, I think they lost to Langley in one of the last games of the season by 3 or 4 points or something like that. So even the scores are not what we've seen in the past, where we've seen the 60-0 and 70-0 and that type of stuff. Because the teams are all in it and they feel they're in it, and all of them are trying to get that one extra inch on each other to get over the hump.
I wanted to mention earlier, National Signing Day. Teams across the CJFL can sign players as of June 1. This year, the BCFC kind of created their own model a little bit, where each team is allowed to get a commitment from up to 5 university or high school players that didn't graduate from high school this past year to get a commitment that, while not binding across the CJFL, is binding in BC, meaning if a player signs with a BCFC or commits to a BCFC team, if he plays in the BCFC, that's the only team he can play for. Let's just talk about the reasoning for that and how you think it's gone so far.
The reasoning behind it, I think, was there's a few different reasonings to it. Is teams can target recruit a little bit easier. And what I mean by that is they don't have to cast the net out as wide as they would if they know player A is already committed to them. That team can then focus on other positions, or don't have to go out and get 6 more of that player in that same position. So there's that component to it. There's a component to the fact that if a player commits, you necessarily don't have to have him, from a cost perspective, come to a spring camp. I've heard that logic, where you could just have him come out for a summer camp and get going that way. The excitement from a media standpoint, the ability to know what you have and where if you can lock in player A and B, then you're strong here, and you get a more idea of what your roster is going to look like as the season goes along. Obviously, June 1st is the signing date, and we have to respect that, because that's a national rule that we have and process that we have. But it came up, and some of the teams brought it up, and we ran with it. And so far, the responses that we've got, and we had them at the AGM, were very positive, and it creates a good excitement. I know I was speaking to Coach Beattie in West Shore, and it allows people are actually having meetings and discussing how they're going to utilize these and institute them at their own club level. So it creates a bit of a buzz. It creates a strategic plan where you have. We toyed with the idea of how many and so forth, but we might decide to leave it as is, depending on what people view as at the end of this. But I think the overall concept has been well received, and I think it might need to be tweaked. But I think for the most part, it's been pretty cool, and the players seem to be all over it, and so far so good. And if there's flaws in it, and if there's things that we have to change, we have to be nimble and creative enough to adjust to those, and not just do the status quo, because doing the status quo, I don't think it does anybody any good.
Two interesting components to it, and we talked about this the other day. One, you can have a player commit to a BCFC team, and there's a couple players that we know teams are talking to right now that, teams are thinking, jeevers, we could waste a letter on this kid, and he could stay at home in Ontario or the prairies. So there's that aspect of it, which is it's just kind of cool. But the bigger thing, we think, we discussed the teams, how many. Initially, it was just you could sign letters of intent. The teams, for their own reasons, came up with that 5 number. But it really is forcing the teams to be strategic on how many and where they use these selections, right, or these letters.
Totally, and that's been the pretty cool part. And hearing the dialogue nowadays with social media and film and everything else, most of the teams know who's recruiting who, and that's something that's changed over time. Is there's not a lot of secrets, and Team A and Team B and Team C or Team D even are going after player A, and it's creating that urgency where my phone may ring at 10 o'clock at night and there's urgency to do something because Team A is worried about Team B, and it's kind of cool that way. But nowadays there's not a whole lot of secrets, and people may think they have their own secrets, but chances are 2 or 3 of our other teams know exactly what's happening, and vice versa. So I think it's with the transparency of and the knowledge that everybody has and who's talking to who and who's recruiting who, I think it's on trend and where we're at with that landscape. So I think, we're early in the endeavor, being only a week or 10 days into it or whatnot, but so far so good. So far so good.
I appreciate you doing this, Mr. President, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you soon.
No problem, anytime.